There are sounds that define an era: the roar of a Lancaster bomber over London, the crackle of a vinyl record just before the music starts, and the splintering crash of a Rickenbacker guitar, sacrificed to the gods of feedback and teenage angst. For a generation, that was the sound of Pete Townshend. It was the sound of fury, of rebellion, a primal scream rendered in wood and wire. But the question that has echoed through the decades, long after the applause has faded, is a simple one. What was he so angry about? The violence of it was always startling. The windmill arm, a frantic, whirling propeller of a limb, would slice through the air, crashing down on the strings with a force that seemed intended to punish the instrument, to tear the sound out of it. And then, at the climax, the ritual slaughter. The guitar slammed against the floor, hammered into the amplifiers, its neck snapped, its body a ruin of jagged splinters. On the surface, it was the ultimate act of rock and roll defiance. But behind the noise, behind the chaos, was a man locked in a battle with ghosts few could see. The instrument wasn't the enemy. It was a casualty of a much deeper, much more private war. To understand Pete Townshend, you have to understand that he wasn't just smashing guitars. He was trying to shatter the silence that had surrounded him since childhood. He was a trailblazer, yes, but he was also profoundly tormented. And the story of his life is the story of a man trying to turn his private pain into a public art form, hoping that if he could just make it loud enough, he might finally drown out the voices in his own head. To understand the boy who would become rock's great intellectual and its most visceral performer, you have to picture the world he was born into. May 1945, the very month that the war in Europe shuddered to a halt. London was a city breathing a collective sigh of relief, but it was a wounded city, a landscape of craters and skeletons of buildings, a place where the ghosts of the Blitz still lingered in the air. This was the backdrop for a generation of children born to parents who had survived the unimaginable, but who carried the psychological shrapnel of that survival in ways they couldn't always articulate. Pete's parents, Cliff and Betty Townshend, were musicians, part of the vibrant dance band scene. His father was a professional saxophonist with the Squadronaires, the Royal Air Force's premier dance orchestra, and his mother was a singer. Music was the family business, a world of melody and rhythm, but it was also a world of transience, of late nights and long absences. The stability that a child craves was often a moving target, and for a period it vanished altogether. When Pete was just a toddler, his parents' marriage hit a turbulent patch. It was a volatile relationship, fueled by the pressures of their profession and at times heavy drinking. In a decision that would cast a long, dark shadow over his entire life, Betty decided to send their young son to live with her own mother, a woman Pete would later describe in chillingly stark terms. This wasn't a kindly, doting grandmother. He called her clinically insane, a very dark individual. For 2 years, from the age of about 4 to 6, Pete was in her care, and it was a period of profound trauma. He later revealed, piecing together fragmented memories only as an adult with the help of his mother, that he had suffered sexual abuse at the hands of men his grandmother brought to the house. Imagine that. A small, sensitive boy, separated from his parents, plunged into a world of neglect and predatory horror, presided over by a figure who should have been his protector. He was, in his own words, left to go feral. This was the foundational wound, a deep psychic injury that would fester for decades, informing the anger, the alienation, and the desperate search for meaning that would define his art. When his parents' careers stabilized and they took him back, the reunion wasn't a simple fairy tale ending. He returned to his own family feeling like an intruder. He had survived his ordeal, but the boy who came back was not the same one who had left. He was watchful, guarded, a stranger in his own home. This sense of being an outsider, of looking for a place to belong, would become a central theme in his life and work. His generation, the first to grow up in peacetime with no great war to fight, was often called a teenage wasteland. But for Pete, the wasteland was not just a societal concept. It was a deeply personal landscape he had already navigated in the dark. It was from this place of rubble and fractured memory that he first picked up a guitar, not just to make music, but to build a fortress. The journey from a fractured childhood to the world stage began, as it so often does, in the crucible of art school. In the early 1960s, Ealing Art College was a hothouse of bohemian ideas, a place where the rigid conformity of post-war Britain was being actively challenged. It was here that Townshend, a thoughtful and intellectually curious young man, found a language for the chaos he felt inside. He wasn't just learning graphic design, he was absorbing the radical philosophies that were bubbling just beneath the surface of pop culture. And then he encountered Gustav Metzger. Metzger was a German-born artist and political activist, a Jewish refugee who had escaped the Nazis. His experiences had led him to formulate a radical artistic concept, auto-destructive art. He argued that in an age capable of unprecedented destruction, the atom bomb being the ultimate example, art must confront this reality. Auto-destructive art was a public art form that mirrored the violence of the system, creating works that were designed to disintegrate, to collapse, to destroy themselves. Metzger wasn't just an eccentric lecturer, he was giving a philosophical framework to annihilation. For Pete Townshend, this was a lightning bolt. In Metzger's ideas, he found a profound connection to his own internal state. He later said, "I wasn't trying to play beautiful music. I was confronting my audience with the awful, visceral sound of what we all knew was the single absolute of our frail existence. One day, an aeroplane would carry the bomb that would destroy us all in a flash." The Cold War terror of nuclear annihilation became a metaphor for his own personal history of destruction. This intellectual underpinning is the great, often overlooked secret of The Who's legendary stage act. The first time he smashed a guitar wasn't a fit of rock and roll peak. It was an accident. At the Railway Tavern in Harrow in 1964, he accidentally thrust the headstock of his Rickenbacker through the low ceiling, cracking the neck. Annoyed and remembering Metzger's lecture, he decided to finish the job. He demolished the rest of the instrument. The crowd, expecting music, was instead confronted with an act of violent artistic catharsis. They went wild. This act transformed The Who. They were no longer just another R&B band in the bustling London scene. They now had a theatrical, dangerous edge. With Roger Daltrey as the swaggering, hyper-masculine frontman, John Entwistle as the stoic, anchor-like bassist, and Keith Moon, a force of joyous, chaotic nature on the drums, Townshend was the intellectual core, the tortured architect of their sound and fury. His windmill strumming, which he cheekily admitted he adapted from seeing Keith Richards warm up his arm backstage, became a visual signature, a gesture of both abandon and aggression. He was a man fighting his instrument, and in doing so he created a sound that was entirely new, the power chord, loud, sustained, and full of defiant energy. It was the sound of a generation's frustration, but for Pete, it was the sound of his own survival. By the late 1960s, The Who were superstars, the embodiment of maximum R&B. They had a string of hit singles that perfectly captured the anxieties and aspirations of the mod generation, my generation. with its audacious line, "Hope I die before I get old," became an anthem for youth in revolt. But Townshend was growing restless. The 3-minute pop song felt too small a container for the vast, complex ideas churning in his mind. He was searching for something more, a way to tell a bigger story, a way to map the psychological terrain he knew so well. This search led him to the spiritual teachings of an Indian master named Meher Baba. Baba, who maintained a vow of silence from 1925 until his death in 1969, taught that the only reality is God and that the purpose of life is to realize this oneness. For Townshend, a man grappling with a traumatic past and the dizzying emptiness of fame, Baba's message of love, surrender, and the illusory nature of the ego was a lifeline. He became a devoted follower, and this newfound spiritual path began to profoundly shape his music. It was in this fertile ground of spiritual seeking and artistic ambition that the idea for Tommy was born. It wasn't just going to be an album, it would be a rock opera, a term Townshend himself helped popularize. The story was a direct channel for his own experiences. Tommy Walker is a boy who, after a traumatic event, becomes psychosomatically deaf, dumb, and blind. He is isolated, locked inside himself, a prisoner of his own senses, or lack thereof. It's impossible not to see the parallels with the young Pete, rendered emotionally mute and invisible by his own early trauma. The narrative of Tommy is a journey through abuse, neglect, and exploitation. He is tormented by his cousin Kevin and molested by his uncle Ernie. These were not the typical subjects of rock and roll. This was raw, uncomfortable, and deeply personal territory. The famous song Pinball Wizard was almost a commercial afterthought, a song Townshend added to appease the rock critic Nick Cohn, who was a pinball fanatic. But its inclusion gave the opera a tangible, triumphant hook. Tommy's uncanny skill at the game becomes his only way of communicating with the outside world, a metaphor for the way Townshend himself used the guitar to speak when words failed him. The creation of Tommy was an obsession. Townshend composed it largely alone, creating elaborate demos in his home studio, layering instruments and vocals, building a complex sonic world. When he presented it to the band, they were reportedly baffled. What was this strange, sprawling narrative? But they trusted their leader's vision. The result, released in 1969, was a landmark achievement. It propelled The Who into the stratosphere, cementing their place not just as rock stars, but as serious artists. They performed Tommy at Woodstock, a moment that became iconic, a fusion of high art and countercultural chaos. For the world, Tommy was a groundbreaking masterpiece. For Pete Townshend, it was a form of therapy, an exorcism. He had taken his silent scream and turned it into an opera. The monumental success of Tommy should have been a moment of ultimate triumph. Instead, it set the stage for what would become Pete Townshend's most ambitious, most spectacular failure, a project so grand and so technologically complex that it nearly drove him to a nervous breakdown. This was Lifehouse. Following Tommy, Townshend was no longer content with just telling a story. He wanted to create an experience, to break down the barrier between the band and the audience. He envisioned Lifehouse not just as an album or a film, but as a living, breathing, multimedia event. The story itself was a sprawling science fiction epic set in a dystopian future where pollution has forced most of humanity to live in pods, experiencing life through a government-controlled network called the Grid. They are fed synthetic entertainment, and rock and roll is a forgotten relic. A small group of rebels led by a Christ-like figure rediscovers music and attempts to stage a concert that will generate a single perfect musical note, a universal chord. that will liberate everyone from their virtual prisons and lead to a collective awakening. It was a staggering concept, deeply influenced by the teachings of Meher Baba and the Sufi musician Inayat Khan, who wrote about the vibrational nature of all existence. Townshend's plan was to make this fiction a reality. He wanted The Who to play a series of concerts at the Young Vic Theatre in London, inviting the audience to participate directly. He planned to use synthesizers, then a new and unwieldy technology, to translate biographical data from individual audience members into unique musical motifs. These motifs would then be woven together by the band, live on stage until they produced the final ecstatic one note. It was brilliant, visionary, and completely impossible. The technology simply didn't exist. The band didn't understand what he was talking about. His collaborator and manager, Kit Lambert, who was struggling with his own addictions, was dismissive and unhelpful. The concerts at the Young Vic were chaotic and frustrating. The audience, expecting a normal Who gig, was confused by the experimental nature of the proceedings. The pressure mounted on Townshend. He was trying to be a composer, a screenwriter, a computer programmer, and a spiritual guru all at once. The dream of a unified, ecstatic experience was collapsing into a nightmare of technical glitches and miscommunication. He suffered a full-blown nervous breakdown. The grand vision of Lifehouse had to be abandoned. He was left with a collection of extraordinary songs, but no framework to hold them together. It was at this low point that the producer Glyn Johns stepped in with a simple, pragmatic suggestion: forget the story, forget the computers, and just make a great rock and roll album. From the ashes of Lifehouse, they salvaged the material that would become Who's Next. Songs like Baba O'Reilly, with its iconic looping synthesizer intro, often mistakenly called Teenage Wasteland, was meant to be the sound of the Lifehouse grid. Won't Get Fooled Again, with its climactic scream and rallying cry of Meet the New Boss, same as the old boss, was a howl of political disillusionment born from the project's failure. Behind Blue Eyes was the lament of the story's villain, divorced from their complex narrative. The songs took on a new power. They became anthems of universal experience, alienation, love, rebellion, and spiritual yearning. Who's Next was released in 1971 and became one of the greatest rock albums of all time. It was a stunning success, but for Townshend, it was also a monument to his greatest failure. He had reached for the stars and had fallen back to earth, but in the process, he had created something raw, powerful, and enduring. The celestial cacophony he had dreamed of was silenced, but the songs that remained spoke volumes. The 1970s were a decade of contradiction for Pete Townshend. On one hand, he was at the peak of his creative powers, following Who's Next with another monumental rock opera, Quadrophenia. This 1973 album was a more grounded, painfully realistic look back at the mod culture that had birthed the band. Its protagonist, Jimmy, suffers from a quadrophenic personality torn between four different identities, mirroring the four distinct personalities within The Who. It was a complex, beautiful, and deeply empathetic work, further cementing Townshend's reputation as rock's premier sociologist and storyteller. But behind the artistic triumphs, the private battles were intensifying. The pressures of being the creative engine for one of the world's biggest bands were immense. He was shouldering the artistic and financial responsibility, while his bandmates, particularly the irrepressible Keith Moon, were descending deeper into the cartoonish excesses of rock stardom. Townshend had always tried to keep a certain distance from the debauchery. He was the thinker, the spiritual seeker, the one who retreated to his home studio to wrestle with concepts and chords. But the darkness he had held at bay for so long began to seep in. He started drinking heavily. It began as a way to cope with the stress, to quiet the anxieties, to bridge the gap between the sensitive artist and the hell-raising rock star the public expected. He later admitted it was a form of self-medication, a way to numb the recurring echoes of his childhood trauma. The man who wrote with such clarity about the dangers of disillusionment was becoming a casualty of his own success. Then, on September 7th, 1978, the chaotic heart of The Who stopped beating. Keith Moon died from an overdose of medication prescribed to help him combat his alcoholism. He was just 32 years old. Moon wasn't just the band's drummer, he was its anarchic spirit, a brother to Townshend. Despite the frustration and the chaos Moon often caused, their bond was deep. His death was a devastating blow, and it sent Townshend into a tailspin. The grief was overwhelming, and he sought refuge at the bottom of a bottle. His drinking escalated dramatically, and he began using cocaine and, for a time, heroin. This was his lost period, a dark descent into addiction that nearly cost him everything. He became the very rock and roll casualty he had so often warned others about. In a candid interview, he later expressed a profound regret, not just for his own actions, but for the culture that celebrated it. He recalled telling Jim Morrison he was turning into a fat drunk and wished someone had had the courage to intervene with friends like Brian Jones or Jimi Hendrix, instead of mythologizing their self-destruction. It was during this bleak period that he released one of his most powerful and commercially successful solo albums, Empty Glass, in 1980. The record is a raw, unflinching document of his state of mind. Songs like Rough Boys and Let My Love Open the Door mix aggression with a desperate plea for connection and redemption. It was a cry for help, set to a catchy tune. He finally hit rock bottom and checked himself into rehab, beginning the long, difficult process of confronting his demons without the buffer of alcohol. He had survived the 70s, but the cost had been immense. He had lost his friend, and for a time, he had nearly lost himself. No examination of Pete Townshend's life can be complete without addressing the most challenging and painful controversy he has ever faced. It's a chapter that complicates his legacy and forces us to grapple with the tangled relationship between an artist's personal demons and their public life. In 2003, his name became publicly linked to Operation Or, a massive British police investigation into a US-based website that distributed child abuse imagery. The facts of the case are these: Townshend's credit card details were found in the website's database. When the police investigated, he admitted to accessing the site. He was arrested and his homes were searched. His explanation, which he has maintained consistently ever since, was that he accessed the site as part of a personal and admittedly misguided research effort. He claimed that, having been a victim of abuse himself, he was trying to understand the mechanics of online child exploitation, to support a campaign against it, and for his own charitable work with abuse survivors. He said he wanted to see for himself the reality of what he was fighting against. No illegal images were found on his computers. The police, after a lengthy investigation, concluded that he was not involved in trading or producing such material. He was not charged with possession. Instead, he accepted a formal police caution for accessing the material and was placed on the sex offenders register for 5 years, a standard procedure in such cases at the time. The public fallout was immediate and brutal. The headlines were sensational. For many, the nuances of the case were lost in the horrific nature of the central subject. His explanation was seen by some as a convenient excuse from a wealthy rock star. The man who wrote Tommy, a story that explored the horrors of child abuse, was now accused of being a participant in a modern version of that same darkness. In his autobiography, Who I Am, Townshend wrote that he accepted the caution because he couldn't bear the thought of a protracted court battle and the toll it would take on his family. He has since expressed regret for that decision, wishing he had gone to trial to prove his innocence. It's also important to note that the wider Operation Ore investigation was later found to be deeply flawed, with thousands of individuals implicated based on fraudulent credit card use, and a failure by law enforcement to distinguish between those who had merely visited a site and those who had downloaded illegal content. This controversy doesn't have a neat or easy resolution. It lives in a deeply uncomfortable gray area. Do we accept his explanation of a tormented man, a survivor of abuse, undertaking a dangerous and naive form of research? Or do we see it as something more sinister? The historical record shows he was cautioned, not convicted. It also shows a man who has spent a significant portion of his life and fortune supporting charities for abuse victims and drug rehabilitation. It's a profound contradiction, a complex and troubling part of a life already full of them. It forces the audience to look at the dark, obsessive side of his lifelong struggle with the legacy of his own abuse, a struggle that in this instance led him to a place of profound moral ambiguity and public condemnation. To measure the legacy of Pete Townshend is to look far beyond the sales figures and the smashed guitars. His significance is etched into the very DNA of modern rock music. He was a sonic architect of the highest order. He didn't invent the power chord, but he harnessed its potential, turning it from a simple musical device into a statement of intent, a thunderous expression of power and defiance. With his pioneering use of Marshall stacks, he created a wall of sound that became the standard for live rock performance. A sound designed not just to be heard, but to be felt in your very bones. His embrace of the synthesizer was revolutionary. At a time when many rock purists viewed electronic instruments with suspicion, Townshend saw their potential. The iconic cycling ARP synthesizer patterns on Baba O'Reilly and Won't Get Fooled Again weren't just novel sound effects. They were integral rhythmic foundations that pushed rock into a new futuristic territory. He brought the avant-garde sensibilities of his art school training into the stadium, bridging the gap between experimental noise and popular anthem. But his most profound contribution was as a songwriter. Before Townshend, the lyrical concerns of rock and roll were largely confined to cars, girls, and dancing. He blew those doors open. He introduced intellectualism, psychological depth, and spiritual inquiry into the pop song format. He proved that a rock album could be a vehicle for a complex narrative, a cohesive work of art. Tommy and Quadrophenia laid the groundwork for the concept albums that would follow, from The Wall to American Idiot. He gave rock and roll a conscience and a vocabulary to talk about its own confusion, its own rage, and its own yearning for grace. He wrote about the teenage wasteland, not as an outsider looking in, but as a resident who knew its streets intimately. His influence is everywhere. You can hear it in the stadium-sized ambition of U2, in the punk rock fury of the Sex Pistols and the Clash, in the intricate songwriting of Bruce Springsteen, and in the raw, confessional grunge of Nirvana and Pearl Jam. Eddie Vedder in particular has been a vocal disciple, inducting The Who into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and acknowledging the profound debt Pearl Jam owes to their emotional honesty and sonic power. Beyond the music, Townshend's life story itself holds a powerful, if cautionary, significance. He was one of the first rock stars to speak openly and with unflinching honesty about his personal demons, about childhood trauma, about addiction, about the spiritual emptiness of fame. He stripped away the myth of the invincible rock god to reveal the fragile, flawed, and searching human being underneath. In doing so, he gave a voice to the unspoken struggles of a generation. He showed us that the same person who could write an anthem of youthful defiance like "My Generation" could also be consumed by doubt, pain, and a desperate need for love and forgiveness. His legacy is not just in the noise he made, but in the silence he dared to fill with difficult truths. In the end, Pete Townshend's story is not a simple rock and roll fable of fame and excess. It is the story of a lifelong, relentless search for a single perfect note. Not a musical note, but a note of truth, of reconciliation. It's the sound he heard in his head as a boy, a celestial chord of both immense suffering and overwhelming grace. His entire life seems to have been an attempt to replicate that sound, to make the world understand the beauty and the terror of what it means to be human. He is a man of staggering contradictions, the intellectual who craved primal violence, the spiritual seeker drawn to worldly temptation, the loud guitarist who suffers from profound hearing loss, and the fierce advocate for abuse survivors, who found himself enmeshed in a controversy that touched that very nerve. He is not a simple hero, nor is he a simple villain. He is something far more interesting. A complex, flawed, and brilliantly articulate witness to his own life. From the shards of his own fractured past, he built a body of work that gave a voice to the voiceless, that made sense of the senseless, and that continues to resonate with anyone who has ever felt like an outsider, anyone who has ever felt that deep, aching need to turn up the volume just to drown out the silence. He may have hoped to die before he got old, but he survived. And in that survival, he has given us something more valuable than any youthful anthem, a sprawling, difficult, and beautiful testament to the fragile, resilient, and electrifying power of the human spirit. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.